We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
The railway car sat in silent accusation beneath the November rain of 1918, its polished wooden panels reflecting the pale faces of German delegates who had come to sign away their empire's honor. Ferdinand Foch, the Marshal of France, watched with cold satisfaction as these representatives of the defeated Reich approached the same carriage where their predecessors had celebrated victory over his nation 47 years earlier. In that moment, as ink dried on the armistice that silenced the guns of the Great War, the seeds of an even more terrible conflict were already taking root in the bitter soil of humiliation. Miles away, in a Pasewalk hospital, a temporarily blinded Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler wept tears of rage as he learned of his adopted homeland's surrender. The poison gas that had seared his eyes during the final offensive had left him helpless in darkness, but his mind burned with visions of revenge that would consume the world. 21 years later, this unknown soldier would stand triumphant in the same forest clearing, watching French generals sign their nation's capitulation in that identical railway car, a moment of vengeance that would crown the most devastating military campaign in European history. The peace conference that assembled in Paris during the winter of 1919 brought together the victorious allies determined to ensure that Germany could never again threaten European stability. David Lloyd, George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson of America gathered around tables laden with maps that would redraw the continent's boundaries. Their solution was the Treaty of Versailles, a document that would strip Germany of territory, military power, and national pride, while saddling the defeated nation with war reparations so massive they would cripple economic recovery for generations. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, forced the new German Republic to accept complete responsibility for the conflict's devastation. This single paragraph would become a rallying cry for every German politician who promised to restore national honor. The treaty's authors believed they were creating lasting peace through the systematic weakening of their former enemy. Instead, they were forging the chains of resentment that would drag Europe back into the abyss of total war. Reparations demanded by the victorious powers reached astronomical proportions that revealed the depth of Allied determination to crush Germany's capacity for future aggression. The London Schedule of Payments, finalized in 1921, required the defeated nation to transfer wealth equivalent to 3 times its entire gross national product. Gold, ships, machinery, livestock, and intellectual property flowed westward in an endless stream designed to compensate the victors, while ensuring that recovery would remain impossible for decades to come. Economic collapse followed with mathematical certainty. By 1923, hyperinflation had transformed the proud German mark into worthless paper. Citizens wheeled barrels of currency to purchase single loaves of bread, while life savings, accumulated over generations, vanished overnight. Middle-class families who had supported the old order found themselves reduced to poverty, their faith in democratic institutions shattered by economic catastrophe. that seemed to validate the most radical critiques of liberal capitalism. Into this chaos stepped politicians who promised simple solutions to complex problems. Benito Mussolini had already demonstrated the appeal of such messages when he marched on Rome in October 1922, transforming himself from a failed socialist journalist into the leader of a revolutionary movement that promised to restore Italy's greatness through violence and national rebirth. King Victor Emmanuel III, faced with the choice between civil war and accommodation, handed power to this former schoolteacher who had reinvented himself as the embodiment of a resurgent Italian spirit. Mussolini's success provided a template that ambitious men throughout Europe would study and adapt to their own circumstances. The combination of paramilitary organization, theatrical propaganda, and promises to overthrow the existing order while restoring national greatness proved irresistible to populations traumatized by war and economic uncertainty. Liberal politicians who offered gradual reforms seemed pathetically inadequate compared to revolutionary leaders who promised immediate transformation through the application of organized force. Munich's beer halls provided the stage for Hitler's political debut when he attempted his beer hall putsch in November 1923. The future dictator, still an unknown agitator with delusions of grandeur, believed he could seize control of Bavaria and march on Berlin just as Mussolini had conquered Rome. Instead, his amateur conspiracy collapsed when police opened fire on his supporters outside the Feldherrnhalle, killing 16 Nazis and sending their leader fleeing in panic. This humiliating failure might have ended his political career, but German justice proved remarkably lenient toward those who claimed patriotic motives for their crimes. Prison became Hitler's university. During his comfortable confinement in Landsberg Fortress, he dictated the first volume of Mein Kampf to his devoted follower, Rudolf Hess. This rambling manifesto combined personal grievances with a comprehensive ideology of racial hatred and territorial expansion that would guide Nazi policy for the next quarter century. The book's turgid prose and extremist content initially attracted few readers, but its core message would eventually resonate with millions of Germans who felt betrayed by democratic politicians and humiliated by foreign occupation. The global economic catastrophe that began with Wall Street's collapse in October 1929 transformed European politics by destroying faith in liberal democracy throughout the continent. Unemployment soared past 6 million in Germany alone, while bank failures wiped out the savings of those who had managed to rebuild their lives after the hyperinflation crisis. Desperate voters turned to extremist parties that promised radical solutions to problems that moderate politicians seemed incapable of addressing through conventional means. Parliamentary democracy, which had seemed to offer hope for peaceful progress during the brief prosperity of the mid-1920s, revealed its weaknesses when faced with economic catastrophe and political polarization. Coalition governments collapsed with bewildering frequency as competing parties proved incapable of agreeing on effective responses to unemployment and social unrest. Street fighting between communist paramilitaries and Nazi stormtroopers turned major cities into battlegrounds where political disputes were settled through violence rather than debate. Heinrich Brüning, appointed Chancellor in March 1930, attempted to govern through emergency decrees that bypassed the paralyzed Reichstag. His deflationary policies, designed to demonstrate fiscal responsibility to foreign creditors, deepened the economic crisis while providing ammunition for extremist critics who argued that democratic politicians cared more about international opinion than German suffering. Each new austerity measure validated Nazi propaganda that portrayed the Weimar Republic as a puppet regime serving foreign masters rather than German interests. Franz von Papen replaced Brüning in May 1932, representing conservative politicians who believed they could use Hitler's popular support while controlling his extremist impulses. This fateful miscalculation reflected the dangerous arrogance of traditional elites who underestimated the revolutionary potential of the Nazi movement. When President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, Papen smugly assured concerned observers that the former corporal would be boxed in by more experienced politicians who understood how the system really worked. Within months, these calculations proved catastrophically wrong. The Reichstag fire of February 27, 1933, provided Hitler with the pretext he needed to suspend civil liberties and arrest his political opponents. Whether the Nazis actually started the blaze remained controversial, but Hitler's response demonstrated his mastery of crisis manipulation. Emergency decrees eliminated constitutional protections, while stormtroopers dragged communists and socialists from their homes in the dead of night. Democracy died not through foreign conquest, but through the systematic abuse of its own institutions by those who had sworn to uphold them. The Enabling Act of March 1933 completed the legal revolution that transformed Germany from a parliamentary republic into a totalitarian dictatorship. Threatened by SA violence and deceived by false promises of moderation, enough Reichstag members voted to grant Hitler dictatorial powers for 4 years. Only the Social Democrats courageously opposed this self-destruction of parliamentary government, earning the futile admiration of posterity while sealing their own doom. Within weeks, their party was banned and their leaders imprisoned or exiled. International reactions to these dramatic changes revealed the dangerous complacency of democratic leaders who hoped that Hitler might somehow be contained through normal diplomatic channels. Many foreign observers initially welcomed the end of political chaos in Germany, believing that a stable government, even an authoritarian one, would be easier to deal with than the constantly changing coalitions that had characterized the Weimar period. This wishful thinking blinded them to the revolutionary nature of the Nazi regime and its fundamental incompatibility with the existing international order. Military rearmament began immediately after Hitler's consolidation of power, though initially concealed through creative accounting and secret programs that violated the Versailles Treaty's restrictions. The 1st Panzer divisions emerged from training exercises disguised as agricultural programs, while the Luftwaffe developed from supposedly civilian flying clubs that happened to include large numbers of former military pilots. By 1935, Hitler felt strong enough to publicly renounce the treaty's military clauses, announcing conscription and revealing the existence of an air force that had been secretly expanding for 2 years. The Rhineland's remilitarization in March 1936 represented Hitler's first direct challenge to the post-war settlement, testing whether France and Britain would enforce the treaty obligations they had sworn to uphold. German troops crossed the Rhine bridges on a Saturday morning when most European governments were distracted by weekend activities, occupying the demilitarized zone with orders to withdraw immediately if Allied forces appeared. The gamble succeeded completely when no opposition materialized, demonstrating to Hitler that democratic leaders lacked the will to confront aggression before it became overwhelming. French Premier Albert Sarraute exemplified the paralysis that gripped democratic governments when faced with authoritarian challenges that fell short of direct attack. Despite commanding military forces that vastly outnumbered the token German detachments in the Rhineland, he refused to act without British support that never materialized. This hesitation established a pattern of missed opportunities that would characterize Western responses to Nazi expansion throughout the 1930s. each failure to act making the next challenge more difficult to meet. Appeasement emerged as official British policy under Neville Chamberlain, who became Prime Minister in May 1937, convinced that reasonable men could resolve any dispute through patient negotiation. His umbrella became the symbol of an approach that confused weakness with statesmanship, treating Hitler as a conventional politician whose demands might be satisfied through territorial concessions, rather than recognizing him as a revolutionary who sought the complete overthrow of the existing order. This fundamental misunderstanding would have consequences that stretched far beyond the crisis it was intended to prevent. Spanish Civil War provided the testing ground where new weapons and tactics were perfected in advance of the greater conflict to come. When Francisco Franco launched his rebellion against the Spanish Republic in July 1936, Hitler and Mussolini seized the opportunity to support a fellow fascist while gaining valuable combat experience for their pilots and tank crews. The bombing of Guernica in April 1937 introduced the world to the terror weapons that would soon devastate cities throughout Europe, while the international community proved incapable of effective action to prevent this rehearsal for apocalypse. Soviet involvement in Spain created dangerous precedents for the political cooperation that would later enable the Nazi-Soviet pact. Stalin's decision to support the Republic, while simultaneously purging Spanish communists who refused to follow Moscow's line, demonstrated the cynical opportunism that characterized his approach to international relations. Western intelligence services noted with alarm the ease with which fascist and communist dictators could cooperate when it served their mutual interests, despite their supposedly irreconcilable ideological differences. Anschluss with Austria in March 1938, achieved through a combination of internal pressure and external intimidation what had been forbidden by the peace treaties of 1919. Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg found himself isolated when Hitler demanded the appointment of Nazi ministers to key positions in his government. When Schuschnigg attempted to hold a plebiscite on Austrian independence, Hitler mobilized the Wehrmacht and crossed the border on March 12th, completing the annexation of his homeland without firing a shot. Enthusiastic crowds in Vienna welcomed the German troops, validating Nazi claims that they were liberating ethnic Germans rather than conquering foreign territory. The Sudetenland crisis brought Europe to the brink of war during the tense months of 1938, as Hitler demanded the annexation of Czechoslovakia's border regions where ethnic Germans formed local majorities. Konrad Henlein, leader of the Sudeten German Party, orchestrated provocations designed to justify German intervention, while the Prague government struggled to maintain order in territories that were being systematically destabilized by Nazi agents. President Edvard Beneš found himself facing an impossible choice between surrender and a war that Britain and France seemed determined to avoid. Munich Conference of September the 29th, 1938, produced the agreement that would forever symbolize the futility of appeasing totalitarian aggression. Chamberlain, convinced that he was preventing a European war through reasonable compromise, joined Mussolini and French Premier Édouard Daladier in pressuring Czechoslovakia to accept German demands for the Sudetenland. The absence of Czech representatives from these negotiations that decided their nation's fate demonstrated the moral bankruptcy of a process that sacrificed democratic allies to purchase temporary peace with dictatorial enemies. Peace for our time became the infamous phrase that Chamberlain proclaimed upon returning to London, waving the worthless paper that bore Hitler's signature alongside his own. Within 6 months, German troops would march into Prague and complete the destruction of Czechoslovakia, proving that appeasement had merely encouraged further aggression rather than satisfying it. the strategic consequences proved even more devastating than the moral ones, as Hitler acquired the Skoda armaments works and other industrial facilities that would significantly strengthen his military capabilities for the war that now seemed inevitable. British guarantee to Poland in March 1939 represented a complete reversal of appeasement policy, but came too late to deter Hitler or to prepare adequate defences for the next target of Nazi expansion. Chamberlain's pledge to defend Polish independence sounded impressive in Parliament, but lacked the military means necessary for implementation. British and French forces could do nothing to prevent a German invasion of Poland except declare war after the fact, leaving their new ally to face the Wehrmacht alone during the crucial opening weeks of what would become the Second World War. Throughout the summer of 1939, diplomatic activity reached fever pitch as all parties maneuvered for advantage in the crisis that everyone recognized was approaching. Stalin watched with cynical amusement as Britain and France half-heartedly courted Soviet support, while simultaneously hoping to avoid the revolutionary contagion that alliance with communism might bring. Hitler, meanwhile, prepared his master stroke, an agreement with Stalin that would eliminate the possibility of a two-front war while enabling both dictators to dismember Poland between them. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, signed in Moscow on August 23, 1939, shocked the world with its revelation that totalitarian enemies could become temporary allies when it served their mutual interests. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop flew to the Soviet capital bearing Hitler's authorization to offer Stalin territorial concessions that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. The Public Non-Aggression Treaty surprised observers who had expected these ideological enemies to remain permanently hostile, but the secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe between German and Soviet spheres of influence represented an even more cynical betrayal of the small nations caught between the two dictatorships. Stalin's calculations reflected his conviction that a war between Germany and the Western democracies would weaken all his potential enemies while strengthening the Soviet Union's relative position. By agreeing to remain neutral while Hitler attacked Poland, he ensured that the conflict would begin as a European rather than a global war. The secret protocols promised him territory in Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland as compensation for this neutrality, enabling him to advance Soviet borders westward without the costs and risks of military conquest. August 31st, 1939, saw Hitler issue the final orders that would unleash the most destructive war in human history. Directive Number 1 for the conduct of the war authorized Fall Weiss, the attack on Poland that would begin at dawn the following morning. All across the Reich, Wehrmacht units moved toward their assembly areas, while Luftwaffe squadrons prepared for the bombing campaigns that would introduce the world to the terror of modern aerial warfare. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, supposedly making a courtesy visit to Danzig, opened fire on the Polish fortress of Westerplatte, beginning a conflict that would rage for 6 years and cost the lives of over 70 million people. 21 years after the railway car ceremony that had ended the war to end all wars, Europe was about to discover that the peace settlement of 1919 had merely provided a 20-year armistice between two acts of an apocalyptic drama. The thunder that had rumbled across the continent throughout the 1930s was about to explode into the lightning war that would reshape the world forever. In the forests of Poland, where the first shots of this new conflict were already echoing, the darkest chapter of human history was about to begin. The screaming dive of Junkers Ju-87 Stukas shattered the morning calm over Warsaw as September 1st, 1939, witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare that would terrorize the world. Bombs crashed into Polish airfields while the defenders' planes still sat helplessly on the ground, their pilots racing futilely toward aircraft that erupted in flames before they could reach the cockpits. This was Blitzkrieg, Lightning Campaign, a revolutionary synthesis of tanks, aircraft, and radio communications that would sweep away the static trench warfare of the previous generation and replace it with a mobile apocalypse that moved faster than human comprehension. General Heinz Guderian watched his panzer columns slice through Polish defenses like steel knives through paper, vindicated at last in his theories about armored warfare that conservative generals had dismissed as reckless fantasy. His 19th Corps spearheaded the drive toward the Vistula, demonstrating how concentrated tank formations supported by dive bombers could achieve breakthrough velocities that made traditional defensive planning obsolete. Behind the advancing panzers, motorized infantry and artillery raced to exploit the gaps, creating a tempo of operations that left enemy commanders struggling to understand what was happening to their carefully prepared positions. Polish cavalry units, magnificent in their traditions and courageous beyond measure, charged against these mechanical monsters in scenes that symbolized the collision between two eras of warfare. At Krojanty, the 18th Lancer Regiment galloped toward advancing tanks with sabers drawn, their horses' hooves thundering against earth that would soon be churned into blood-soaked mud. These desperate attacks achieved nothing except to demonstrate that individual heroism, however magnificent, could not overcome the systematic application of industrial technology to the ancient art of destruction. Within 18 days, the Polish army ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The Luftwaffe had destroyed most of their air force on the ground during the first morning, while panzer spearheads had shattered defensive lines before reserves could be brought forward to restore them. Most devastating of all was the psychological shock of facing enemies who moved and struck with unprecedented speed, leaving defenders feeling helpless against forces that seemed to anticipate their every move, while remaining immune to conventional countermeasures. Stalin's invasion from the east on September 17th delivered the final blow to Polish resistance, crushing any remaining hope that the nation might somehow survive this double assault. Red Army units crossed the border in overwhelming strength, occupying territories that the Nazi-Soviet pact had secretly assigned to Soviet control. This coordinated betrayal by both totalitarian neighbors demonstrated how completely the small nations of Eastern Europe had been abandoned by the democratic powers who had guaranteed their independence just months earlier. The last Polish strongholds fell on October 6th, marking the completion of a campaign that had introduced the world to the terrifying efficiency of modern mechanized warfare. Warsaw's ruins smoldered under skies darkened by smoke from burning buildings, while columns of prisoners marched toward an uncertain fate in captivity. The speed of this collapse shocked military observers throughout Europe, forcing them to reconsider fundamental assumptions about defensive strategy and the balance between offense and protection in contemporary combat. Winter descended upon Europe with an eerie calm that journalists dubbed the phony campaign, as French and British armies sat behind the Maginot Line, while their leaders hoped that economic blockade might somehow force the Reich to negotiate without requiring the massive battles that everyone dreaded. General Maurice Gamelin commanded over 3 million Allied troops along the Western Front, yet made no serious attempt to relieve pressure on Poland by launching diversionary attacks that might have drawn Wehrmacht units away from their eastern offensive. This inaction reflected the defensive mentality that had dominated Allied strategic thinking since the carnage of 1918, when generals had learned to fear the terrible costs of offensive operations against prepared positions. The Maginot Line, that marvel of concrete and steel fortification, seemed to offer perfect security against invasion, while enabling France to avoid the massive casualties that had nearly destroyed her during the previous conflict. Unfortunately, this static approach ignored the revolutionary changes in military technology that made such linear defenses increasingly obsolete. Behind their fortifications, Allied soldiers spent the winter months playing cards, writing letters, and wondering when the real fighting would begin. Some optimists even hoped that the Reich might somehow collapse from internal economic pressures, sparing everyone the necessity of another devastating European struggle. These illusions reflected the democratic world's continuing failure to comprehend the revolutionary nature of the Nazi regime and its fundamental commitment to reshaping Europe through conquest rather than negotiation. The Führer used this breathing space to plan operations that would demonstrate the continuing evolution of blitzkrieg tactics when applied to different geographical and strategic circumstances. Fall Gelb, the upcoming campaign in the West, would test whether the lightning methods that had proved so successful in Poland could achieve similar results against better equipped opponents operating from prepared defensive positions. The answer to this question would determine not just the fate of France and Britain, but the future direction of global civilization. Spring arrived with shocking suddenness on April 9th, 1940, when Operation Weserübung launched simultaneous invasions of Denmark and Norway that caught the entire world off guard. Danish resistance collapsed within hours as airborne troops seized key airfields, while naval forces captured major ports before defenders could organize effective opposition. The speed of this conquest demonstrated how thoroughly modern military technology had compressed the time available for political decision-making, transforming international crises from diplomatic marathons into tactical sprints. Norway's mountainous terrain offered better defensive opportunities, but even there, innovative German tactics overcame geographical advantages through the systematic application of air power and amphibious assault techniques. Paratroopers dropped from the sky to seize crucial airfields at Oslo and Stavanger, while naval infantry stormed ashore at Narvik and other strategic ports. Norwegian forces, though brave and determined, lacked the equipment and coordination necessary to counter such multidimensional attacks executed with clockwork precision. British attempts to intervene in Norway revealed the extent to which democratic military establishments had fallen behind in adapting to the new realities of mechanized warfare. The hastily assembled expeditionary force that landed at various Norwegian ports lacked the air support, artillery, and logistical capabilities necessary for operations against opponents who controlled both sea and sky. Within weeks, these forces were evacuated in circumstances that presaged the more famous retreat from Dunkirk that would follow just months later. The Norwegian campaign's conclusion left the Reich in control of crucial naval bases and iron ore supplies, while demonstrating that geography alone could no longer provide security against enemies who possessed the technological means to project power across vast distances. Sweden's neutrality became meaningless when Wehrmacht units could strike from occupied Norwegian territory, while Britain's naval supremacy proved inadequate to prevent amphibious landings supported by overwhelming air power. May 10th, 1940, dawned with the roar of 2,000 aircraft crossing the frontiers of Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, as Fall Gelb finally unleashed the Western offensive that would decide Europe's fate. Paratroopers descended from the morning sky to seize key bridges and fortifications, while glider-borne assault troops landed directly on top of Belgium's supposedly impregnable Fort Eben-Emael. These vertical envelopment tactics achieved complete tactical surprise, capturing objectives that conventional attack methods would have required weeks of siege operations to reduce. The Ardennes forest, dismissed by Allied planners as impassable to large armored formations, became the highway for Guderian's Panzer Corps, as they struck toward the Channel coast in the most decisive flanking movement since Hannibal's march on Rome. 7 panzer divisions emerged from the wooded hills like prehistoric monsters, their tracks churning narrow country roads into rivers of mud while their cannons swept aside the scattered French units that attempted to block their advance. General Erwin Rommel led the 7th Panzer Division in a lightning advance that earned him the nickname Desert Fox, years before he ever set foot in Africa. His aggressive leadership from the front lines, constantly moving between threatened sectors to inspire his troops and coordinate attacks, demonstrated the kind of dynamic command style that blitzkrieg tactics demanded. Traditional generals who tried to control mobile operations from distant headquarters found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by opponents who understood that speed of decision-making had become as important as firepower in determining combat outcomes. Allied commanders struggled to comprehend the pace of events as their carefully prepared defensive plans disintegrated under the impact of attacks that came from unexpected directions with overwhelming force. General Gamelin's strategy of advancing into Belgium to meet the invasion collapsed when the main assault materialized hundreds of kilometers to the south, cutting his armies off from their bases and surrounding them in a pocket that grew smaller with each passing hour. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister on May 10th, the same day that the Western Offensive began, inheriting a strategic situation that would have tested the capabilities of any leader. His first speech to Parliament acknowledged the grim realities facing Britain. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." These words captured the essence of democratic resistance to totalitarian aggression, promising a struggle that would continue regardless of immediate tactical outcomes or strategic disadvantages. The breakthrough at Sedan on May 13th shattered French morale as thoroughly as it destroyed their defensive positions. Guderian's panzers crossed the Meuse River under cover of concentrated Stuka attacks that pulverized defensive positions while demoralizing troops who had never experienced such intensive aerial bombardment. Within hours, the German bridgehead had expanded beyond the capacity of French reserves to contain, creating a gap in Allied lines that would never be closed. Belgian and Dutch resistance collapsed with shocking rapidity as their armies found themselves caught between advancing Wehrmacht units and the impossible choice between surrender and the destruction of their ancient cities. Rotterdam's bombing on May 14th demonstrated the Reich's willingness to use terror tactics against civilian populations, while the threat of similar treatment convinced other urban centers to surrender rather than face annihilation from the air. French refugees clogged the roads leading away from the advancing panzers, creating massive traffic jams that prevented military units from reaching their assigned positions while providing perfect targets for Luftwaffe fighters. These scenes of civilian panic became symbols of the social breakdown that accompanied military defeat, as entire populations discovered that their governments could no longer provide the basic protection that justified their existence. The miracle of Dunkirk began on May 26th, when Operation Dynamo launched the desperate attempt to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force from beaches, where it had been trapped by Guderian's advance to the Channel coast. Lord Gort, commanding the BEF, recognized that continuation of offensive operations had become impossible, and that evacuation offered the only alternative to complete surrender. His decision to retreat toward the coast, though strategically sound, abandoned French allies who had expected continued British participation in the defense of their homeland. For 9 days, an improvised armada of destroyers, fishing boats, pleasure craft, and anything else that could float shuttled back and forth across the Channel, carrying exhausted soldiers to safety, while Luftwaffe bombers tried to disrupt the evacuation. RAF Fighter Command stretched to its limit, provided air cover that prevented complete disaster, while demonstrating the crucial importance of maintaining some degree of air superiority even during retreat operations. The evacuation's success in saving 338,000 troops represented both a tactical triumph and a strategic disaster. While the soldiers themselves had been rescued, virtually all their equipment remained behind on the beaches, leaving Britain defenseless against invasion, except for the Royal Navy and the thin line of RAF fighters that would soon face their greatest test. The rescued army would require months of re-equipment and retraining before it could again participate in major combat operations. Charles de Gaulle's radio broadcast from London on June 18th provided the voice of continued French resistance, even as the government in Bordeaux sought terms for surrender. France has lost a battle, not the campaign, declared this relatively unknown general, who had demonstrated the possibilities of armored warfare during brief counterattacks near Laon. His appeal for continued resistance established the Free French movement, while rejecting the defeatism that had paralyzed official French leadership. Marshal Philippe Pétain signed the armistice on June 22nd in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918, completing the circle of revenge that the Führer had dreamed of during his days of blindness in the Pasewalk hospital. The symbolism of this ceremony, with French representatives forced to accept terms in the identical location where their predecessors had dictated to defeated Germans, demonstrated how completely the balance of European power had shifted in just 6 weeks of lightning campaign. The fall of France represented more than just another military victory. It marked the apparent triumph of authoritarian efficiency over democratic deliberation, of technological innovation over traditional methods, of revolutionary energy over conservative caution. Across the world, observers struggled to understand how the nation that had been considered Europe's premier military power could have collapsed so completely against enemies that many had dismissed as dangerous amateurs just months earlier. Britain stood alone as summer 1940 arrived, protected only by the narrow waters of the English Channel and the courage of RAF pilots who would soon face the largest air offensive in history. The Luftwaffe had never been defeated in sustained combat, while the Royal Navy, though still powerful, could do nothing to prevent invasion if the Germans achieved air superiority over the Channel and the landing beaches. Hermann Göring's bombers began their assault on British airfields and radar stations in July, launching the Battle of Britain that would determine whether the island fortress could survive the hurricane of steel that had already devastated the rest of Europe. Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes climbed to meet formations of Heinkel He-111s and Dornier Doe Tantuschian 17s, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, beginning an aerial campaign that would test the limits of both technology and human endurance. The few, as Churchill called the RAF pilots who bore the burden of this unequal struggle, faced odds that would have been considered impossible in any previous conflict. Fighter Command could field barely 700 operational aircraft against a Luftwaffe that possessed over 2,600 bombers and fighters. Yet the British possessed advantages that partially offset this numerical inferiority. Radar early warning systems that provided crucial tactical intelligence, proximity to their bases that maximized time over target, and most importantly, the knowledge that defeat meant not just military surrender, but national extinction. London's civilians endured the Blitz with a stoicism that surprised even themselves, spending their nights in underground stations while German bombers pounded their city with high explosives and incendiaries. The civilian response to this terror campaign demonstrated that democratic societies, when fighting for survival, could display the same determination and sacrifice as their totalitarian opponents. Each morning brought new scenes of devastation, Yet somehow life continued, shops reopened, and people went to work amid the rubble of their former neighborhoods. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve the air superiority necessary for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. Fighter Command, though bloodied and exhausted, had prevented the destruction of RAF airfields and aircraft factories that would have made invasion possible. This first major defeat of German arms demonstrated that blitzkrieg tactics, however revolutionary, were not automatically decisive against opponents who possessed adequate defensive capabilities and the will to use them effectively. The Führer's attention turned eastward as autumn arrived, drawn by the vast territories and resources of the Soviet Union that had always featured prominently in his long-term strategic vision. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, would dwarf all previous campaigns in scale and ambition, while testing whether blitzkrieg methods could achieve decisive results across the enormous distances and harsh climate of the Russian steppe. Soviet forces, despite having nearly 2 years to prepare for this attack, remained vulnerable to the tactical innovations that had proved so devastating in Poland and France. Stalin's purges had eliminated most experienced commanders, while his insistence on maintaining defensive positions along the frontier provided perfect targets for the encirclement tactics that German generals had perfected during their Western campaigns. June 22nd, 1941, marked the beginning of the largest military operation in human history, as 3 million Axis soldiers crossed the Soviet frontier along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Army Group North struck toward Leningrad, Army Group Center drove toward Moscow, and Army Group South advanced into Ukraine, each spearhead supported by overwhelming air power and guided by the same tactical principles that had already conquered most of Europe. Initial successes exceeded even the most optimistic German expectations, as entire Soviet armies found themselves trapped in massive encirclements around Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers marched into captivity, while their equipment fell into German hands virtually intact. The scale of these victories suggested that the Soviet Union might collapse as quickly as France had just a year earlier. Leningrad found itself under siege by September as Army Group North reached the outskirts of the city that bore Lenin's name. The 900-day blockade that followed would test the endurance of both besiegers and defenders, while demonstrating that even the most advanced military technology could not guarantee rapid victory against opponents willing to accept unlimited sacrifice in defense of their homeland. The drive toward Moscow stalled in the autumn mud as winter arrived earlier than German planners had anticipated. Wehrmacht units that had advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks suddenly found themselves struggling to move supplies forward over primitive roads that had turned into impassable quagmires. Soldiers who had expected to be home by Christmas instead faced a Russian winter for which they had made no adequate preparations. Soviet counterattacks launched in December 1941 revealed that the Red Army retained significant reserves and fighting capabilities, despite the massive losses of the campaign's opening months. Fresh divisions transferred from Siberian garrisons struck German spearheads that had become dangerously overextended, forcing retreats that shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility and demonstrated that even blitzkrieg had its operational limits. As 1941 drew to a close, the easy victories were over. The lightning campaigns that had conquered most of Europe in less than 2 years had finally encountered opponents who possessed both the resources and determination necessary for prolonged resistance. The age of swift, decisive victories was ending, replaced by a grinding contest of national endurance that would test every aspect of military, economic, and social organization. In the forests outside Moscow, where Wehrmacht units dug defensive positions for the first time since the campaign began, the curtain was rising on a vast and merciless chapter of the war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the flagship Nagato in Hiroshima Bay, watching the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled prepare for an operation that would reshape the global balance of power. 6 aircraft carriers, loaded with 353 bombers and fighters, rode at anchor in the morning mist of November 26, 1941, while their crews made final preparations for a voyage that would carry them across 3,000 miles of empty Pacific to strike at the heart of American naval strength. The architect of this audacious plan understood better than most that he was about to awaken a sleeping giant whose industrial might could ultimately overwhelm his island nation. Yet circumstances had left Japan with no alternative except this desperate gamble for swift victory. For 4 years, the Japanese Empire had been locked in an expanding conflict with China that consumed enormous resources while producing no decisive results. The Marco Polo Bridge incident of July 1937 had escalated from a minor clash between Japanese and Chinese troops into a full-scale invasion that drew millions of soldiers into battles across vast distances from Manchuria to Canton. Emperor Hirohito's armies had captured Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing, yet Chinese resistance continued under Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government and Mao Zedong's communist forces, both of whom preferred to fight the foreign invaders rather than each other. President Franklin Roosevelt watched these developments with growing alarm, recognizing that Japanese expansion threatened not just Chinese independence, but the entire structure of international law and collective security that America hoped would prevent another global catastrophe. The Panay incident of December 1937, when Japanese aircraft deliberately attacked an American gunboat on the Yangtze River, demonstrated Tokyo's willingness to challenge Western interests directly, while testing whether the United States possessed the resolve to defend its citizens and principles in distant waters. American economic pressure escalated throughout 1940 and 1941 as Roosevelt's administration implemented a series of trade restrictions designed to force Japan's withdrawal from China without resorting to military confrontation. The Export Control Act authorized limitations on strategic materials, while the freezing of Japanese assets in July 1941 effectively ended normal commercial relations between the two nations. Most devastating of all was the oil embargo that cut off Japan's access to the petroleum supplies, essential for both military operations and civilian economic activity. General Hideki Tojo, who became Prime Minister in October 1941, embodied the military faction that viewed further negotiation as both futile and humiliating. His rise to power reflected the Japanese leadership's conviction that their empire faced a stark choice between submission to American demands or a desperate attempt to seize the resources necessary for continued independence through military conquest. The decision for conflict had essentially been made when previous diplomatic efforts failed to resolve the fundamental contradiction between Japanese expansion and American principles. Secret negotiations continued, even as both sides prepared for hostilities, with Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura meeting regularly with Secretary of State Cordell Hull in Washington, while Yamamoto's fleet steamed toward its target. These talks served primarily to maintain the appearance of peaceful intentions, while military preparations reached their final stages. Hull's note of November 26th, demanding complete Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina, was correctly interpreted in Tokyo as an ultimatum that no Japanese government could accept without losing all credibility with its own people. The Pearl Harbor strike force followed a northern route across the Pacific, that avoided commercial shipping lanes while maintaining radio silence to prevent detection by American intelligence services. Task Force commanders had studied every detail of the Hawaiian naval base through intelligence gathered by diplomatic personnel and tourists, creating target folders that identified the precise locations of fuel tanks, ammunition depots, and the battleships that formed the backbone of Pacific Fleet strength. December 7th, 1941, dawned clear and calm over Oahu as American service personnel prepared for another routine Sunday in what most considered a peaceful backwater assignment. Radar operators detected approaching aircraft formations at 7:02 a.m., but their warnings were dismissed by duty officers who assumed the contacts represented expected B-17 flying fortresses arriving from California. This communication failure epitomized the peacetime mentality that had left American forces unprepared for the revolutionary concept of carrier-based air attacks launched from beyond visual range. At 7:55 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the first wave of 183 aircraft over Pearl Harbor's anchorages, radioing Tora, 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 to signal that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers screamed down on Battleship Row, while Nakajima B 5N Kate torpedo bombers skimmed across the water at masthead height, their weapons striking the massive vessels with devastating precision. Within minutes, the USS Arizona exploded in a fireball that killed 1,177 sailors, while the USS Oklahoma capsized after taking multiple torpedo hits. The second wave arrived at 8:54 a.m. to complete the destruction of American air power, while attacking targets that had survived the initial assault. Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Kaneohe Naval Air Station became infernos as Japanese fighters strafed parked aircraft that offered perfect targets for pilots who had trained relentlessly for this moment. By the time the last attackers departed at 9:45 a.m., they had sunk or damaged 18 warships, while destroying 188 aircraft and killing 2,403 Americans. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commanding the Pacific Fleet, watched his command burn from the windows of his headquarters, while struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his forces. The 8 battleships that had represented American naval supremacy in the Pacific were gone. Some sunk, others damaged beyond immediate repair. Yet the Japanese had missed the most crucial targets of all. The aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were at sea during the attack, while the fuel storage tanks and repair facilities that would enable rapid recovery remained intact. Roosevelt's address to Congress on December 8th transformed American public opinion overnight, uniting a previously divided nation behind the call for total victory against enemies who had chosen to begin hostilities through unprovoked aggression. Yesterday, December the 7th, 1941. A date which will live in infamy, declared the president, capturing the moral outrage that would sustain American determination through the dark months ahead. Within hours, Congress had declared the existence of a state of conflict with Japan by margins that reflected the complete collapse of isolationist sentiment. The strategic miscalculation underlying the Pearl Harbor attack became apparent only gradually, as Yamamoto's fears about awakening American industrial potential proved prophetic. While the tactical success had been complete, eliminating American battleship strength in the Pacific, the assault had also provided Roosevelt with the political justification necessary for full participation in the global struggle against fascist expansion. The American people, who had resisted involvement in foreign conflicts just days earlier, now demanded revenge against enemies who had struck without warning or declaration. Japanese expansion throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia proceeded with lightning speed that matched the most successful European blitzkrieg campaigns. General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 25th Army invaded Malaya on December 8th, advancing down the peninsula with bicycle troops and light tanks that moved faster than British defenders could organize effective resistance. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore fell on February 15, 1942, surrendering along with 80,000 troops in what Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa's 14th Army landed in the Philippines on December 22nd, forcing Douglas MacArthur's combined American and Filipino forces to retreat into the Bataan Peninsula, where they would conduct a desperate defense lasting 4 months. MacArthur's evacuation to Australia in March, though strategically necessary, left his troops feeling abandoned as they faced overwhelming odds without hope of reinforcement or supply. The subsequent Bataan Death March would demonstrate Japanese military culture's callous disregard for prisoners who had violated the warrior code by choosing surrender over death. Hong Kong's garrison surrendered after 18 days of hopeless resistance, while Dutch forces in the East Indies collapsed under the weight of coordinated air, sea, and land assaults that overwhelmed their scattered defensive positions. The speed of these conquests reflected careful Japanese planning and the advantages of interior lines that enabled rapid concentration of force against isolated garrisons that could receive no mutual support across the vast distances of the Pacific Theater. Burma's conquest opened the door to India while cutting the Burma Road that had provided China's last reliable supply line to the outside world. British forces under General William Slim conducted a fighting retreat across hundreds of miles of jungle terrain, demonstrating the tactical excellence that would later enable their recovery, but unable to prevent the loss of this crucial strategic territory. The fall of Rangoon eliminated the main port through which supplies had reached Chinese forces, forcing reliance on the much more difficult air route over the Himalayas. Admiral Chester Nimitz assumed command of the Pacific Fleet amid the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, inheriting a strategic situation that would have tested any commander's capabilities. The loss of battleship strength forced reliance on aircraft carriers that many naval traditionalists still considered auxiliary vessels. Yet this apparent weakness would prove to be a blessing in disguise as aviation emerged as the decisive factor in Pacific naval operations. Carrier task forces under admirals like William Bull Halsey began launching hit-and-run raids against Japanese installations throughout the Central Pacific, demonstrating that American naval power retained significant offensive capabilities despite the Pearl Harbor losses. These operations provided crucial experience in carrier aviation, while boosting civilian morale through proof that the United States could strike back against enemies who had seemed invincible during the early months of their expansion. The Doolittle Raid of April 18, 1942, epitomized this aggressive spirit when 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers launched from the carrier USS Hornet to attack targets in Japan itself. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's volunteers flew missions that were essentially one-way operations, crash landing in China after dropping their bombs on Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya. The material damage inflicted was negligible, yet the psychological impact was enormous, proving that Japan's home islands were vulnerable to attack while forcing the diversion of resources to homeland defense. Strategic coordination among the Grand Alliance began to emerge as Churchill and Roosevelt met with their military staffs to establish priorities for the global struggle ahead. The Germany First strategy reflected recognition that Nazi industrial and scientific capabilities posed the greater long-term threat, while Japanese expansion, however spectacular, remained fundamentally limited by geography and resources. This decision would shape Allied strategy throughout the conflict, ensuring that the European theater received priority in men and material, despite Pacific setbacks. Soviet resistance on the Eastern Front prevented the Wehrmacht from achieving the rapid victory that would have freed resources for other theaters, creating a three-front global conflict that stretched Axis capabilities beyond their breaking point. Stalin's desperate requests for a second front in Europe could not be immediately satisfied, but American Lend-Lease aid began flowing to the Soviet Union in quantities that would prove crucial for sustaining resistance during the darkest months of the German advance. The Battle of the Atlantic intensified as German U-boats exploited American unpreparedness to launch Operation Drumbeat against shipping along the eastern seaboard. Admiral Karl Dönitz's submarines found targets silhouetted against the lights of coastal cities, whose civilian authorities had not yet implemented blackout procedures, sinking merchant vessels within sight of beaches where tourists continued their normal activities. These second happy time attacks demonstrated how quickly the conflict had become truly global, bringing destruction to American shores just weeks after Pearl Harbor. Convoy systems that had proved effective in protecting British shipping were gradually extended to American coastal waters, while the Liberty ship construction program began producing merchant vessels faster than submarines could sink them. The arsenal of democracy that Roosevelt had promised was beginning to function, though months would pass before American production reached the levels necessary for simultaneous offensives in multiple theaters. By summer 1942, the Axis had reached its greatest territorial extent, controlling an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the central Pacific islands, from the Arctic Ocean to the Sahara Desert. Yet this apparent triumph masked fundamental weaknesses that would become apparent as the Allies recovered from their initial defeats and began coordinating their vast resources for sustained campaigns. The easy victories were ending, replaced by grinding contests that would test every aspect of national strength and determination. In the coral atolls of the central Pacific, where Admiral Nimitz was preparing to challenge Japanese naval supremacy, the first signs of this transformation were already becoming apparent. The sleeping giant was awakening, and its industrial heartland lay far beyond the reach of any enemy attack. From the ruins of early defeat, a new battle was rising, one that would determine whether free peoples could bend history away from the shadow of dictatorship. Rifle fire cracked and artillery roared through the wreckage-littered streets of Stalingrad in August 1942, as the deadliest urban conflict in history erupted. General Friedrich Paulus led his Sixth Army into a city that bore Stalin's name, confident that this latest objective would fall as quickly as the dozens of Soviet cities that had already succumbed to Wehrmacht efficiency. Instead, his 250,000 soldiers found themselves trapped in a nightmare of house-to-house fighting, where survival was measured in hours and territorial gains were counted in meters rather than kilometers. Vasily Zaitsev crouched behind the shattered concrete of a factory wall, his rifle scope trained on a distant helmet that might conceal a Reich sniper stalking through the skeletal remains of apartment buildings. The most famous marksman of the Red Army had already claimed over 200 enemy lives in this urban wasteland, where every window could hide death, and every basement might shelter desperate defenders. His duel with Major Koenig, the Bavarian aristocrat sent specifically to eliminate him, embodied the personal nature of combat in a city where anonymous mass warfare had given way to intimate struggles between individual soldiers. Stalin's order, number 227, not one step back, transformed retreat from tactical option into capital offense, ensuring that Soviet troops would fight with the desperation of men who knew that survival lay only in victory. Political commissars enforced this decree with summary executions, creating a reign of terror behind the lines that matched the horror unfolding in the city's burning districts. The message was clear: death might await those who advanced against the enemy, but it certainly awaited those who fled. Nikita Khrushchev served as Stalin's personal representative in the besieged city, coordinating the flow of reinforcements across the Volga River while ensuring that military commanders understood the political consequences of failure. His presence symbolized the regime's total commitment to holding this strategic prize regardless of cost, transforming a tactical engagement into a test of wills between two dictatorships that could afford no sign of weakness before their watching empires. The 62nd Army, under General Vasily Chuikov, became the backbone of resistance, establishing defensive positions in the grain elevator, the railway station, and the tractor factory that would be captured and recaptured dozens of times as both sides fed troops into the urban meat grinder. Chuikov's headquarters moved constantly to avoid artillery strikes, sometimes operating from cellars just hundreds of meters from enemy positions, while coordinating the complex logistics of urban warfare. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga under cover of darkness, running the gauntlet of artillery fire and air attacks that turned each supply mission into a desperate gamble. These night crossings brought not just men and ammunition, but also the specialized equipment required for fighting in ruins: flamethrowers, grenades, submachine guns, and the close-quarters weapons that determined survival in combat, where enemies might be separated by single walls. German casualties mounted with each passing week as Paulus discovered that conventional military doctrine offered few solutions for conquering a city defended by troops who preferred death to surrender. The Luftwaffe's tactical air support, so effective in open terrain, proved largely useless against targets concealed in basements and tunnels. Artillery bombardments that had shattered enemy formations in previous campaigns now simply created more hiding places for defenders who fought from the wreckage of their own positions. Marshal Georgy Zhukov arrived at Stavka headquarters in Moscow during September, already formulating the counteroffensive that would transform this defensive struggle into the turning point of the entire Eastern Front. Operation Uranus would strike at the weakest sectors of the Axis line, the Romanian and Italian armies guarding the Reich's flanks, while the Wehrmacht remained fixated on conquering the city that had become an obsession rather than a rational military objective. November 19th, 1942, brought the dawn that changed everything, as Soviet artillery opened fire along a front stretching hundreds of kilometers north and south of the embattled city. The 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, equipped with obsolete weapons and lacking the fanatical motivation of their allies, collapsed within hours under the weight of mass tank attacks supported by overwhelming air power. By November 23rd, the pincers had closed, trapping Paulus and his entire army in a pocket that grew smaller and more desperate with each passing day. The irony was complete. Hunters had become the hunted. Besiegers had become the besieged. Wehrmacht units that had advanced 1,000 kilometers from their starting positions now found themselves surrounded in the ruins they had created, dependent on air supply through a corridor controlled by enemies who had learned to coordinate anti-aircraft defenses with devastating effectiveness. Hermann Göring's promise to supply the surrounded army by air proved as hollow as most Luftwaffe boasts during this period of the conflict. Transport aircraft attempting to reach Paulus required 750 tons of supplies daily to maintain minimum effectiveness, yet the improvised airlift managed barely a quarter of that amount on its best days. Ju's 52 transports fell victim to Soviet fighters and flak batteries that turned each supply mission into a one-way journey for increasing numbers of irreplaceable crews and aircraft. Christmas 1942 found the once mighty Sixth Army reduced to eating horses, dogs, and finally leather boots, as starvation joined cold and enemy fire among the forces destroying Reich military power. Soldiers who had conquered most of Europe now died of hunger in cellars, where temperatures fell far below zero, their frozen corpses becoming landmarks in a hellscape that mocked every assumption about technological warfare's ability to overcome human endurance. General Manstein's relief attempt, launched in December with the best armored units available on the Eastern Front, came tantalizingly close to breaking through the Soviet encirclement before grinding to a halt just 50 kilometers from the surrounded garrison. Paulus received orders to fight his way out to meet the relief force, but his army lacked the fuel, ammunition, and fighting strength necessary for such an operation. The moment of possible salvation passed, leaving the doomed garrison to face its fate alone. Surrender came on February 2nd, 1943, when Paulus emerged from his bunker to formally capitulate rather than follow his Führer's orders to fight to the last man. Of the 330,000 Axis soldiers who had entered the Stalingrad pocket, fewer than 90,000 survived to begin the march to Siberian camps from which most would never return. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility died in those frozen ruins, replaced by the reality that superior numbers, industrial production, and strategic depth could overcome tactical excellence when sustained over sufficient time and distance. 4,000 kilometers to the southwest, General Bernard Montgomery prepared his Eighth Army for the offensive that would break Axis power in North Africa and open the path toward Hitler's European fortress. The Second Battle of El Alamein would test whether British forces had learned the lessons of previous defeats, while demonstrating the growing effectiveness of Allied coordination between ground, air, and naval forces. Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had advanced to within 60 miles of Alexandria during the summer of 1942, threatening the Suez Canal and the oil resources that sustained Britain's entire strategic position in the Mediterranean and Middle East. The Desert Fox's reputation for tactical brilliance had made him a legend throughout both armies, yet his extended supply lines and dwindling resources created vulnerabilities that Montgomery intended to exploit through careful preparation and overwhelming material superiority. Churchill's direct intervention in desert command arrangements brought Montgomery to Egypt with clear instructions. No more retreats, no more improvised defenses, no more tactical defeats that squandered strategic opportunities. The new commander's methodical approach to planning and his insistence on numerical superiority before launching offensives reflected lessons learned through 3 years of costly experience against Wehrmacht tactical excellence. Operation Lightfoot began on October 23, 1942, with an artillery barrage involving 1,000 guns that shattered the night across a front stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the Qattara Depression. Montgomery's plan emphasized attrition rather than maneuver, grinding through Axis defensive positions with systematic advances that traded time for casualties while preserving the armored reserves that would exploit any breakthrough opportunity. The Desert Air Force, now operating with numerical superiority for the first time in the North African campaign, provided close support that neutralized the Luftwaffe while interdicting supply convoys struggling to reach Rommel across the Mediterranean. Malta-based aircraft and submarines had already reduced Axis logistics to a trickle, forcing the Afrika Korps to fight with dwindling fuels and ammunition reserves that made sustained resistance impossible. Rommel's counterattacks demonstrated the tactical skill that had made him famous, yet each engagement consumed irreplaceable resources, while British strength continued growing through supplies that arrived safely via the Cape route. The mathematics of attrition favored Montgomery, who could afford to trade material for space, while his opponent faced shortages that would eventually prove decisive regardless of tactical outcomes. November 4th marked the breakthrough that Montgomery had planned so carefully, as Operation Supercharge finally shattered Axis defenses and forced Rommel to begin the long retreat that would not end until his army reached Tunisia. The pursuit that followed demonstrated how completely the balance of forces had shifted in North Africa, with British armoured divisions advancing hundreds of kilometres, while their opponents struggled to maintain any coherent defensive line. Operation Torch landed 3 Allied armies in Morocco and Algeria on November 8th, opening the second front in North Africa that would trap Axis forces between converging offensives while providing invaluable experience in amphibious operations for the European invasion still being planned. General Dwight Eisenhower commanded this complex, multinational operation, beginning his education in coalition warfare that would prove crucial for success in larger campaigns ahead. American forces under General George Patton secured Morocco with characteristic speed and aggressiveness, while British troops landed near Algiers to begin the advance eastward toward Tunisia. The coordination required for these simultaneous operations across such vast distances demonstrated the growing sophistication of Allied planning, while providing practical experience in the logistics of global warfare. Vichy French forces offered varying degrees of resistance before Admiral François Darlan's controversial agreement ended most fighting and opened ports and airfields to Allied use. This political arrangement, though criticized for compromising with fascist collaborators, provided immediate strategic benefits that accelerated the campaign's progress, while demonstrating the complex moral compromises that global conflict imposed on democratic leaders. Halfway across the world, Admiral Nimitz prepared for the naval engagement that would determine whether Japanese expansion could be halted before their empire became too large for Allied forces to assault successfully. The Battle of Midway would test revolutionary concepts of carrier aviation against an enemy who had perfected these same techniques during their spectacular conquests of the previous 6 months. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sought to force a decisive engagement that would eliminate remaining American carrier strength before industrial production could replace the losses suffered at Pearl Harbor. His complex plan involved diversionary attacks against the Aleutian Islands, while the main force struck Midway Atoll, expecting to catch American forces off guard and complete the destruction of Pacific Fleet capabilities, begun so successfully 6 months earlier. American codebreakers provided Nimitz with unprecedented intelligence about enemy intentions, enabling defensive preparations that would neutralize Japanese advantages in numbers and experience. Commander Joseph Rochefort's team had penetrated enough of the Japanese naval code to predict not just the target, but the timing and composition of the attacking force, providing the kind of strategic intelligence that commanders throughout history had dreamed of possessing. Task Force 16 under Admiral Raymond Spruance and Task Force 17 under Admiral Frank Fletcher represented the last significant American naval strength in the Pacific, operating with the knowledge that defeat would leave the West Coast vulnerable to attack while eliminating any possibility of offensive operations for months or years to come. The stakes could hardly have been higher for a nation still reeling from the disasters that had followed Pearl Harbor. June 4th, 1942, dawned with Japanese carriers launching their first strike against Midway's installations, while American aircraft searched the empty ocean for targets that remained beyond visual range. The revolution in naval warfare that carriers represented was about to be tested in the first engagement between opposing fleets that never saw each other except through the eyes of their aircrews. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led his dive bombers through broken clouds toward the Japanese formation, arriving at the precise moment when enemy fighters were at low altitude, having just repelled torpedo attacks that achieved no hits, but drew defensive coverage away from the vulnerable carriers. The next 5 minutes would change the course of the Pacific struggle, as American SBD Dauntlesses screamed down on flight decks loaded with fuel and ammunition. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu erupted in flames that could be seen for miles, as bombs penetrated their wooden flight decks and ignited the aviation fuel and ordnance that made carriers so effective, yet so vulnerable. Within hours, 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were sinking beneath the Pacific swells, taking with them not just ships, but the irreplaceable pilots who had given Japanese naval aviation its decisive edge during the early months of expansion. Admiral Nagumo's remaining carrier, the Hiryu, launched a desperate counterattack that damaged the USS Yorktown before succumbing to American dive bombers later that afternoon. The mathematical exchange, 4 Japanese carriers for 1 American, represented a strategic disaster for an empire that lacked the industrial capacity to replace such losses while facing enemies whose production capabilities were just beginning to reach full potential. The strategic consequences of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical losses, marking the end of Japanese offensive operations and the beginning of an American advance that would continue without major reversal until victory 3 years later. Yamamoto's attempt to force a decisive engagement had indeed proved decisive, though not in the manner he had intended. Guadalcanal became the testing ground where these strategic shifts would be confirmed through 6 months of grinding combat that demonstrated American determination to accept casualties while maintaining offensive momentum. The landing of Marines on August 7, 1942, marked the beginning of the first major Allied ground offensive against Japanese positions, initiating a campaign that would validate the industrial and demographic advantages that Midway had revealed. Strategic bombing of the Reich intensified throughout 1942 and 1943 as RAF Bomber Command and the US 8th Air Force began systematic attacks on industrial targets that tested whether air power alone could achieve decisive results. The 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne in May 1942 demonstrated the scale that Allied air operations were beginning to achieve, while the Ploesti oil raids of August 1943 showed the willingness to accept heavy losses in pursuit of strategic objectives. These bombing campaigns forced the diversion of enormous resources to homeland defense, weakening other fronts while subjecting civilian populations to the same terror that Wehrmacht forces had inflicted on their enemies during the early campaigns. The moral implications of area bombing would be debated long after the conflict ended. Yet the immediate strategic impact was undeniable in its effectiveness at disrupting enemy production and morale. Resistance movements throughout occupied Europe gained strength and coordination as the tide of battle shifted, transforming from isolated acts of sabotage into systematic campaigns that tied down substantial enemy forces while gathering intelligence for the invasions being planned. The French resistance, Yugoslav partisans, and Soviet guerrillas demonstrated that populations could maintain active opposition even under the most brutal occupation regimes. By early 1943, the strategic initiative had passed to the Allies on every major front except in the Atlantic, where U-boat campaigns continued to threaten the supply lines that sustained resistance. Yet even there, new technologies and tactics were beginning to turn the balance, setting the stage for the great offensives that would carry the conflict into its final phases. The shadow of Axis dominance was lifting, giving way to brutal campaigns that would decide which side could summon deeper resolve and greater strength. As night clung to the early hours of July 10th, 1943, The sky above Sicily trembled beneath the weight of 2,000 planes, advancing in an airborne strike like no other. Gliders carrying British and American paratroopers cut their tow cables over the Mediterranean, while transport planes prepared to disgorge their human cargo onto landing zones that intelligence reports suggested would be lightly defended. General Montgomery's 8th Army and General Patton's 7th Army were about to launch Operation Husky, the invasion that would crack open Hitler's fortress Europe and begin the liberation of the continent from fascist tyranny. Major General James Gavin jumped with his 82nd Airborne Division into the chaotic night above Sicily, landing miles from his intended drop zone among olive groves, where scattered paratroopers struggled to find their units in the darkness. The airborne assault that was supposed to secure key objectives ahead of the beach landings had become a confused nightmare of misdropped troops, lost equipment, and communication failures that threatened to compromise the entire operation before it truly began. Despite these initial setbacks, Allied forces stormed ashore at dawn, across beaches stretching from Syracuse to Licata, encountering resistance that varied from fierce determination to immediate surrender, depending on whether they faced veteran Wehrmacht units or demoralized Italian coastal divisions. The diversity of enemy response reflected the growing cracks within the Axis alliance, as Mussolini's forces showed increasing reluctance to die for their allies' imperial ambitions. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham's naval forces provided devastating fire support that pulverized coastal fortifications while maintaining complete control of the surrounding waters. The Royal Navy's dominance in the Mediterranean had been purchased through 3 years of savage fighting. But now that superiority enabled amphibious operations on a scale that would have been impossible during the dark days of 1940 and 1941. Messina became the prize both Allied armies raced to capture, as Montgomery's methodical advance up the eastern coast competed with Patton's aggressive drive through the island's mountainous interior. The rivalry between these two commanders, though sometimes counterproductive, reflected the competitive spirit that drove Allied forces to achieve results that exceeded even their most optimistic planning assumptions. Resistance collapsed with stunning rapidity as Italian forces surrendered en masse, while their commanders sought accommodation with invaders who offered preferable alternatives to continued alliance with increasingly demanding partners. The psychological impact of fighting on European soil for the first time since 1940 energized Allied troops, while demonstrating to populations throughout occupied Europe that liberation was not merely a distant hope but an approaching reality. King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed Mussolini on July 25, 1943, ending the fascist regime that had ruled Italy for over 20 years and sending shockwaves through the Axis alliance. The architect of fascism found himself under arrest, his grandiose dreams of a new Roman Empire reduced to the reality of military defeat and popular rejection. This dramatic reversal illustrated how quickly authoritarian regimes could collapse once their aura of invincibility had been shattered by military failure. Marshal Pietro Badoglio's new government immediately began secret negotiations with the Allies, while maintaining the pretense of continued Axis solidarity to prevent Wehrmacht occupation of the peninsula. These delicate diplomatic maneuvers reflected Italy's desperate attempt to extricate itself from a conflict that had brought nothing but disasters, while avoiding the harsh retribution that open betrayal of their former ally would certainly provoke. September 8, 1943, brought the announcement of Italy's surrender, transforming erstwhile enemies into co-belligerents while creating new challenges for Allied commanders, who now faced the prospect of advancing through a country whose legal government welcomed their arrival, but whose territory remained occupied by determined enemies. The contradiction between political cooperation and military resistance would characterize the Italian campaign for the remainder of the conflict. Wehrmacht forces under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had anticipated Italian betrayal and moved swiftly to occupy strategic positions throughout the peninsula, converting their former allies' territory into a series of defensive lines that would test Allied capabilities for the next 20 months. The rescue of Mussolini by Otto Scorzini's commandos demonstrated Reich determination to maintain at least the appearance of Axis solidarity while establishing the puppet Italian Social Republic in the north. Allied landings at Salerno on September 9th encountered fierce resistance as Kesselring's forces attempted to drive the invaders back into the sea before they could establish secure beachheads. The battle for the landing zones became a desperate struggle that nearly succeeded in achieving Wehrmacht objectives, saved only by naval gunfire and air support, that enabled the buildup of sufficient strength to withstand determined counterattacks. Monte Cassino became the symbol of Italian campaign frustrations, as Allied forces spent months attempting to break through defensive positions that commanded the approaches to Rome. The ancient monastery, perched on its commanding height, was reduced to rubble by Allied artillery and bombing, yet Wehrmacht paratroopers continued to defend the ruins with fanatical determination that extracted enormous casualties from attacking forces. 4 separate assaults failed to dislodge defenders who had transformed every stone into a fortress and every crater into a machine gun nest. Polish Second Corps finally captured the heights in May 1944, but the cost had been enormous and the strategic benefits questionable, given the time and resources consumed in this prolonged siege operation. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Red Army launched operations that dwarfed the Italian campaign in scale and strategic significance. The lifting of Leningrad's siege in January 1944 ended 872 days of suffering that had claimed over 1 million civilian lives, while demonstrating the incredible endurance of Soviet populations under conditions that would have broken less determined societies. Marshal Leonid Govorov's Leningrad Front and Marshal Kirill Meretskov's Volkhov Front coordinated attacks that shattered Army Group North's siege lines, finally opening land corridors to a city whose survival had become a symbol of resistance throughout the Soviet Union. The relief of Leningrad represented more than a tactical victory. It proved that no position was impregnable when attacked by forces possessing adequate resources and unlimited determination. Operation Bagration, launched on June 23, 1944, demonstrated the Red Army's evolution into the most effective ground force in the world, as 3 million Soviet troops attacked along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Pripyat marshes. This offensive commemorated the 3rd anniversary of Barbarossa by destroying Army Group Center so completely that Wehrmacht resistance in central Russia effectively ceased to exist as an organized phenomenon. Marshal Ivan Bagramyan's 1st Baltic Front and Marshal Ivan Chernyakhovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front achieved breakthrough velocities that exceeded even the most successful blitzkrieg campaigns of 1940 and 1941. Soviet tank armies advanced over 400 kilometers in 2 weeks, encircling entire divisions while capturing equipment and prisoners in quantities that demonstrated how completely the balance of forces had shifted on the Eastern Front. Minsk fell on July 3rd, followed by Vilnius, then Brest-Litovsk, each capture marking another milestone in the advance that would carry Red Army units to the gates of Warsaw by summer's end. The speed of this offensive shocked even Stalin, who had grown accustomed to impressive victories, but had not anticipated that his forces could achieve such decisive results against opponents who still possessed considerable theoretical strength. Planning for Operation Overlord proceeded simultaneously with these campaigns, as Allied commanders prepared for the most complex military operation in history. General Eisenhower's appointment as Supreme Allied Commander reflected American dominance in the coalition, while acknowledging the political and strategic challenges inherent in managing competing national interests within a unified command structure. The deception campaign that preceded D-Day demonstrated Allied mastery of intelligence warfare, as Operation Fortitude convinced Wehrmacht commanders that the main attack would fall on the Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. Double agents, dummy installations, and phantom armies created an elaborate fiction that kept strong reserves away from the actual landing sites, while validating the intelligence assessments that Axis planners wanted to believe. Weather conditions during early June 1944 tested Eisenhower's judgment as storms in the English Channel forced postponement of operations that had been planned with clockwork precision. The decision to proceed on June 6th, despite marginal conditions, reflected the Supreme Commander's recognition that further delays would compromise operational security while missing the optimal tidal and lunar conditions that would not recur for weeks. Paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped into the darkness behind Utah Beach during the early hours of June 6th, beginning the liberation of Western Europe through small unit actions that often descended into confused firefights between scattered troops trying to locate their objectives in unfamiliar terrain. The success of these airborne operations depended less on tactical precision than on individual initiative and the aggressive leadership of junior officers who improvised solutions to problems that no amount of planning could have anticipated. Dawn revealed the greatest armada ever assembled, as over 5,000 ships approached the Normandy coast, carrying 150,000 assault troops supported by thousands of aircraft that had achieved complete air superiority over the invasion beaches. The sight of this vast fleet stretching beyond the horizon convinced even skeptical observers that the Allies possessed the resources necessary for sustained offensive operations rather than merely hit-and-run raids. Omaha Beach became synonymous with heroism and sacrifice, as American troops of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions struggled ashore under withering fire from Wehrmacht positions that commanded every approach to the high ground beyond the waterline. The slaughter in the surf zone nearly forced abandonment of this sector, prevented only by individual acts of courage that gradually established footholds from which organized attacks could be launched. General Omar Bradley watched the disaster unfolding on Omaha from his command ship, seriously considering evacuation before reports began arriving of small groups infiltrating the bluffs, while naval gunfire silenced the most dangerous enemy positions. The battle for this crucial beach lasted most of the day, but by evening, American forces had established a precarious foothold that would be expanded into the breakout zone from which mechanized divisions would soon pour into the French countryside. Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches witnessed more successful landings as specialized equipment and hard-won experience enabled rapid establishment of secure perimeters. British and Canadian forces advanced inland against resistance that varied from fanatical determination to token opposition, depending on the quality and positioning of defending units. Rommel's absence from his headquarters during the crucial opening hours reflected Wehrmacht's fundamental misreading of Allied intentions and capabilities. The Desert Fox was visiting his wife for her birthday, convinced that weather conditions made invasion impossible, while his superiors refused to release panzer reserves without authorization from the Führer, who was sleeping late and could not be disturbed with requests for operational decisions. The missed opportunity to crush the landings during their most vulnerable phase demonstrated how completely initiative had passed to the Allies, whose commanders possessed both the authority and the resources necessary for rapid decision-making under changing circumstances. By the time Wehrmacht reserves finally received permission to counterattack, Allied forces had consolidated their positions sufficiently to repel assaults that might have proved decisive if launched immediately. Caen became the objective that absorbed Montgomery's attention for weeks as British and Canadian forces struggled to capture this crucial transportation hub against determined resistance from elite SS divisions. The prolonged battle for this Norman city consumed enormous resources while providing time for American forces to build up strength in sectors where enemy resistance proved less formidable. The breakout from Normandy finally came in late July, when Operation Cobra shattered Wehrmacht defensive lines west of St. Lo, opening gaps through which Patton's Third Army poured like water through a broken dam. The transformation from grinding attrition to mobile warfare happened with startling suddenness, catching defenders unprepared for the speed with which mechanized divisions could exploit tactical breakthroughs. Liberation of Paris on August 25th, 1944, provided the symbolic climax toward which all previous operations had been building since the dark days of 1940. Charles de Gaulle's return to the capital he had been forced to abandon represented more than personal vindication. It demonstrated that democratic governments could survive even the most comprehensive defeats if their leaders possessed sufficient determination to continue resistance from exile. The sight of French civilians lining the Champs-Élysées to welcome their liberators validated every sacrifice that had been made during 4 years of seemingly hopeless struggle. Liberation meant more than military victory. It represented the restoration of hope that freedom could triumph over tyranny when supported by adequate force and unwavering determination. Soviet advances during the summer of 1944 carried the Red Army across the boundaries of the pre-war Soviet Union for the first time since 1941, transforming a defensive struggle for survival into an offensive campaign for the liberation of Eastern Europe. The crossing of the Dniester River marked the beginning of operations that would carry Stalin's forces to the gates of Berlin, while establishing Soviet influence throughout the territories their armies would occupy. Romania's surrender in August 1944 eliminated one of the Reich's last significant allies, while opening the Balkans to Soviet penetration. King Michael's coup against the pro-Axis government demonstrated how quickly satellite states could change sides once Wehrmacht protection became unavailable, presaging similar defections throughout Eastern Europe. Bulgaria, Hungary, and Finland would soon follow Romania's example, as the logic of military defeat overcame ideological alignment or fear of Soviet occupation. The collapse of the Axis satellite system reflected not just military pressure, but the political consequences of backing the losing side in a struggle where compromise had become impossible. As 1944 drew to its close, Allied forces stood poised along the frontiers of the Reich itself, while enemy resistance showed signs of increasing desperation rather than diminishing strength. The final campaigns that would decide Europe's fate were about to begin, testing whether totalitarian fanaticism could somehow overcome the crushing material superiority that democratic determination and industrial capacity had finally brought to bear against fascist aggression. Snow fell heavily through the Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944, muffling the sound of tank engines and marching boots as 250,000 Wehrmacht soldiers launched their final gamble in the west. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army and Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army emerged from the winter darkness like grey ghosts, striking at American positions held by inexperienced troops who had been sent to this quiet sector to recover from earlier battles or gain their first taste of combat. Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's desperate attempt to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, began with tactical surprise so complete that entire regiments found themselves surrounded before their commanders understood what was happening. The Führer had conceived this offensive during sleepless nights in the Wolf's Lair, convinced that one decisive blow could shatter the enemy coalition and force a negotiated peace that might preserve something of his crumbling empire. His fantasy that Allied unity would collapse under pressure ignored the fundamental transformation of the strategic situation since 1940, when similar surprise attacks had achieved spectacular results against opponents who lacked the resources and determination that now characterized the forces closing in on the Reich from all directions. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe found himself surrounded in the Belgian town of Bastogne with the 101st Airborne Division, facing overwhelming odds as Panzer spearheads bypassed his position while continuing their drive toward the Meuse River. When surrender demands arrived under flags of truce, his one-word reply, "Nuts," became legendary as an expression of American determination to resist regardless of circumstances. The subsequent siege would test whether airborne troops could hold a crucial road junction against armored attacks supported by the finest units remaining in Wehrmacht service. General George Patton demonstrated the flexibility that made him America's finest tactical commander by wheeling his Third Army 90 degrees north and advancing through blizzard conditions to relieve the surrounded garrison. This maneuver, accomplished in 72 hours, despite winter weather and enemy resistance, represented logistics and leadership on a scale that previous generations of soldiers could never have imagined possible. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had cost the Wehrmacht its last operational reserves, while accomplishing nothing except to delay the inevitable assault on the Reich's heartland. American casualties exceeded 75,000, but these losses could be replaced, while the 100,000 casualties suffered by Axis forces represented irreplaceable veterans whose destruction left defensive positions throughout Western Europe fatally weakened. The Eastern Front exploded into motion on January 12, 1945, as Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front launched operations that would carry the Red Army from the Vistula River to the gates of Berlin in just 3 weeks. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers advanced behind artillery barrages that turned the frozen Polish landscape into a moonscape of craters and devastation, sweeping aside Wehrmacht positions that had been prepared for months, but lacked the troops necessary for effective defense. Stalin had timed this offensive to coincide with the Reich's commitment to the Ardennes, ensuring that reserves could not be transferred eastward to meet the primary threat to his empire's survival. The coordination between Allied operations demonstrated how completely the initiative had passed to enemies who possessed both the resources and strategic vision necessary for conducting simultaneous campaigns across multiple theaters. Warsaw fell on January the 17th, 4 months after the tragic uprising that had consumed the Polish Home Army in a futile attempt to liberate their capital before Soviet forces arrived. The city's destruction represented one of the conflict's most cynical betrayals, as Stalin's forces halted their advance while Wehrmacht units systematically eliminated potential rivals for post-war political control. Over 200,000 Polish civilians died during the 63-day battle, victims of totalitarian rivalry that treated entire populations as expendable pawns in geopolitical calculations. Soviet tank armies advanced at speeds that exceeded the most successful blitzkrieg campaigns of 1940 and 1941, covering distances in days that had taken Wehrmacht units weeks to traverse during their period of tactical superiority. The 2nd Guards Tank Army reached the Baltic coast near Danzig by January 26th, cutting off Army Group North in East Prussia while opening direct routes toward the Reich capital that lay just 60 kilometers from advancing spearheads. Refugees streamed westward ahead of the Soviet advance in columns that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, carrying their possessions in carts and sleds while enduring temperatures that fell far below zero. These civilian evacuations represented one of the largest population movements in history, as millions of Germans fled territories their ancestors had inhabited for centuries, rather than face occupation by enemies whose treatment of prisoners and civilians had become legendary for its brutality. Meanwhile, Allied forces in the west crossed the Rhine River on March 7, 1945, when advance units of the 9th Armored Division discovered that the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen remained intact despite Wehrmacht demolition attempts. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann led his company across this crucial span, while engineers worked frantically to remove explosive charges that could have sent the entire structure plunging into the icy waters below. General Eisenhower immediately recognized the strategic significance of this unexpected opportunity, rushing reinforcements across the river while engineers constructed additional bridges to support the massive supply requirements of mechanized divisions operating in enemy territory. Within days, Allied armor was pouring into the German heartland through a gap that could not be closed, despite desperate counterattacks by remaining reserves. Additional crossings at Oppenheim and Wesel extended the breakthrough along the entire length of the Great River Barrier that Wehrmacht commanders had hoped might provide defensive positions comparable to those they had held along the Atlantic Wall. The speed with which these obstacles were overcome demonstrated how completely Allied superiority in engineering, logistics, and tactical aviation had negated traditional defensive advantages. The encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region trapped over 300,000 Axis troops under Field Marshal Walter Model, eliminating the Reich's last significant concentration of ground forces in the west, while capturing the factories that had produced much of the equipment that made Wehrmacht resistance possible. Model's suicide on April 21st symbolized the hopelessness that had infected command structures throughout the collapsing empire. Allied advances accelerated as organized resistance crumbled, with mechanized divisions advancing hundreds of kilometers per day through territory defended only by scattered units of questionable loyalty and effectiveness. The Autobahn system that had been constructed to facilitate rapid military movement now enabled enemy spearheads to penetrate deep into areas that possessed no defensive preparations adequate for modern warfare. Concentration camps liberated by advancing Allied forces revealed the full horror of the Holocaust, providing undeniable evidence of systematic genocide that shocked even veterans who had witnessed 4 years of brutal combat. General Eisenhower ordered extensive documentation of these discoveries, recognizing that future generations might find such atrocities difficult to believe without overwhelming photographic and testimonial evidence. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. Each name became synonymous with evil beyond human comprehension, as Allied soldiers discovered the remnants of Hitler's final solution. The skeletal survivors who greeted their liberators bore witness to crimes that revealed the true nature of the regime, that had promised to create a 1,000-year empire based on racial superiority and conquest. In Berlin, the Führer retreated to his underground bunker as Soviet artillery shells began falling in the government district, transforming the once mighty capital of the Reich into a battlefield where individual buildings changed hands multiple times during desperate street fighting. The man who had promised his followers that their empire would endure for a millennium now cowered 50 feet beneath the ruins of his grandiose architectural monuments. Marshal Zhukov's assault on the capital began on April 16th with an artillery barrage involving 40,000 guns and rocket launchers that could be heard hundreds of kilometers away. The Silo Heights The last significant defensive position protecting Berlin fell after 3 days of savage fighting that cost both sides enormous casualties, and while demonstrating that Wehrmacht units retained their tactical excellence even as strategic defeat became inevitable. Urban combat in Berlin reached unprecedented levels of intensity as Soviet assault troops fought their way through city blocks, defended by a mixture of SS fanatics, regular army units, and teenage conscripts who had been pressed into service during the regime's final desperate attempt to stave off defeat. The psychological impact of fighting in the enemy capital energized Soviet soldiers, while demoralizing defenders who could see no hope of relief or reinforcement. Adolf Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, ended the political career of the man who had promised to reshape European civilization according to his racial fantasies and imperial ambitions. His death in the bunker, accompanied by Eva Braun, in a ceremony that mockingly mimicked the bourgeois respectability he had publicly scorned, represented the pathetic conclusion to a movement that had caused the deaths of tens of millions while achieving nothing except destruction and suffering. The battle for the Reich Chancellery became a symbol of Nazi fanaticism, as SS guards fought to the death, defending ruins that possessed no strategic value, except as the site where their Führer had chosen to make his final stand. Soviet troops who reached the building's upper floors planted the red flag of victory on April 30th, though fighting continued for several more days as isolated pockets of resistance gradually surrendered or were eliminated. Admiral Karl Dönitz assumed leadership of what remained of the Reich government, inheriting a position that existed more in theory than reality, as Allied forces occupied virtually all territory that had been under Axis control just months earlier. His primary responsibility became negotiating surrender terms that might preserve some vestige of organized authority during the transition to occupation administration. The surrender ceremony at Reims on May 7th, 1945, was repeated in Berlin the following day to satisfy Soviet demands for formal recognition of their predominant role in defeating the Wehrmacht. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the unconditional surrender that ended European hostilities, though his sullen demeanor suggested that military defeat had not necessarily convinced all Reich leaders of the justice of their enemy's cause. Victory in Europe Day, celebrations on May 8th, 1945, mark the end of nearly 6 years of continental warfare that had cost an estimated 35 million European lives, while demonstrating both the destructive potential of industrial technology and the ultimate superiority of democratic societies when faced with existential threats to their survival. However, the global conflict was far from over. In the Pacific theater, Japanese forces continued to resist with fanatical determination, despite the obvious hopelessness of their strategic position. The island-hopping campaign had brought Allied forces within striking distance of the Japanese home islands, yet the prospect of invasion promised casualties that might exceed all previous losses combined. Iwo Jima had provided a preview of what invasion might cost when 22,000 Japanese defenders fought almost to the last man while inflicting 26,000 American casualties during 36 days of savage fighting for an island barely 8 square miles in area. The iconic photograph of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of American determination. Yet the mathematical implications of such casualty ratios suggested that invasion of Japan itself might require sacrifices that would test democratic resolve to its limits. Okinawa confirmed these fears, as the largest Pacific battle consumed 3 months and over 200,000 casualties, while demonstrating that Japanese civilians would fight alongside military units rather than surrender to foreign occupation. Kamikaze attacks reached unprecedented intensity, with suicide pilots sinking or damaging over 400 Allied vessels, while proving that technological superiority could not eliminate determined human resistance when backed by cultural traditions that preferred death to dishonor. President Harry Truman faced the most momentous decision in human history as scientists at Los Alamos completed development of atomic weapons that promised to end the conflict without the massive casualties that invasion would require. The choice between nuclear attack and conventional assault involved moral calculations that would influence international relations for decades to come. Yet the immediate responsibility was clear: end the conflict as quickly as possible while minimizing American losses. The Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Airfield at 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, carrying a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy toward Hiroshima, the industrial city that served as headquarters for Japan's Western Defense Command. Colonel Paul Tibbets piloted this mission with full understanding of its historical significance, knowing that the weapon in his bomb bay possessed destructive power equivalent to 20,000 tons of conventional explosives. At 8:15 a.m. local time, nuclear fire consumed the center of Hiroshima in a flash brighter than the sun, instantly killing over 70,000 people while demonstrating that human ingenuity had finally created weapons capable of ending civilization itself. The mushroom cloud that rose over the devastated city announced the beginning of the atomic age, transforming international relations through the introduction of destructive capabilities that made total war potentially suicidal for any nation that possessed such weapons. 3 days later, Fat Man destroyed much of Nagasaki, proving that the first atomic attack had not been an isolated demonstration, but rather the beginning of systematic nuclear warfare that would continue until Japanese surrender eliminated the need for further destruction. The second bomb convinced Emperor Hirohito and his advisors that continued resistance would result only in the complete annihilation of Japanese civilization. August 15th, 1945, brought the Emperor's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender, ending the most destructive conflict in human history through words transmitted by the same technology that had been used to coordinate the mechanized slaughter of the preceding 6 years. Hirohito's acknowledgement that the war situation has not necessarily developed to Japan's advantage represented masterful understatement, yet his decision to surrender preserved his nation from invasion that would have consumed millions of additional lives. The formal surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, witnessed General Douglas MacArthur accepting the capitulation of an empire that had controlled territory stretching from Manchuria to the Central Pacific just months earlier. The sight of Japanese officials bowing before Allied representatives symbolized the complete reversal of power relationships that 6 years of total warfare had produced. World War II had closed its brutal chapter, but what followed was a world split by power and ideology. Two giants emerging from the wreckage, each armed with the means to end all life. The war's cost was beyond reckoning. Cities crumbled, tens of millions buried, and countless lives uprooted. Yet from the ruins rose a fragile but vital truth: that the defeat of totalitarianism offered the hope of a world reborn in freedom. General Dwight Eisenhower stood among the skeletal remains of what had once been Dresden's magnificent Baroque architecture, surveying devastation so complete that identifying individual buildings had become impossible. The Allied bombing campaign of February 1945 had transformed this cultural jewel into a moonscape of rubble and twisted metal that stretched beyond the horizon, creating a wasteland where 25,000 civilians had perished in firestorms that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Across Europe, similar scenes of destruction mark the end of civilization's most devastating conflict, leaving behind ruins that would take generations to rebuild and scars that would never fully heal. The scale of devastation exceeded anything in recorded history, as entire cities lay buried beneath mountains of debris. Hamburg's residential districts had been consumed by firestorms that created their own weather systems, while Cologne's ancient cathedral stood isolated among acres of flattened buildings, like a Gothic monument to human endurance. In the east, Warsaw existed only as scattered piles of brick and stone after Wehrmacht engineers had systematically demolished every structure following the unsuccessful uprising of 1944. Displaced persons camps sprouted across the continent as relief organizations struggled to provide shelter and sustenance for over 11 million people who had been uprooted by conflict, persecution, or the massive population transfers that followed military defeat. These temporary settlements housed everyone from concentration camp survivors and former slave laborers to ethnic populations expelled from territories that had changed national allegiance during the preceding 6 years of upheaval. Colonel Edward Phillips administered one such camp near Munich, confronting daily the overwhelming human misery that represented the true cost of total warfare. Former professors slept beside factory workers in barracks designed for military personnel, while children who had never known peacetime played among refugees, who spoke dozens of languages but shared the common experience of having lost everything they had once considered permanent. Liberation of the Nazi death camps revealed the full scope of the Holocaust, as Allied soldiers discovered evidence of systematic genocide that had claimed 6 million Jewish lives, along with millions of other victims targeted for elimination by racial ideology. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, Soviet troops found gas chambers still containing the Zyklon B canisters used for mass murder, while crematoria bore witness to industrial killing on scales that challenged human comprehension. Captain Abraham Klausner, a Jewish chaplain with the US Army, worked tirelessly to document survivor testimonies and locate missing family members among the skeletal figures who emerged from these hell camps. His efforts represented humanity's first attempt to comprehend crimes so vast that existing legal frameworks provided no adequate response, establishing precedents for international justice that would influence law and diplomacy for decades to come. Bergen-Belson's liberation on April 15, 1945, confronted British soldiers with scenes that would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin described finding piles of corpses, naked and obscene, with a woman too weak to stand propping herself against them as she cooked the food we had given her over an open fire. The contrast between the pastoral German countryside and these monuments to human evil illustrated the moral chasm that separated democratic civilization from totalitarian barbarism. Medical officers struggled to save survivors whose bodies had been reduced to near skeletal conditions by starvation and disease, often finding that liberation had come too late for victims whose systems could no longer process normal nutrition. Dr. Hugh Llewellyn Glyn Hughes, who supervised relief efforts at Belsen, estimated that 500 people died daily during the first weeks after liberation, their bodies finally succumbing to damage that years of brutality had inflicted. The Nuremberg trials began on November 20th, 1945, in the Bavarian city where the Nazi Party had held its most spectacular rallies during the years of triumph and expansion. Justice Robert Jackson's opening statement for the prosecution declared that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated, establishing principles of international law that held individuals accountable for crimes against humanity regardless of their official positions or claims to have been following orders. Hermann Göring dominated the defendant's dock through his defiant refusal to acknowledge guilt for policies he had helped formulate and implement. The former Reichsmarshal's attempts to justify Nazi actions revealed the intellectual bankruptcy of racial ideology, while demonstrating how completely the movement's leaders had been corrupted by power and their own propaganda. His suicide on October 15, 1946, just hours before his scheduled execution, represented a final act of defiance against justice he refused to recognize as legitimate. Rudolf Hess presented a different spectacle, as his apparent mental deterioration during captivity raised questions about his competency to stand trial for crimes committed before his bizarre flight to Britain in 1941. His confused testimony and obvious psychological instability illustrated how completely the Nazi hierarchy had been populated by individuals whose judgment had been warped by ideological fanaticism and personal ambition. Julius Streicher's pornographic anti-Semitism, displayed even during his trial testimony, revealed the depths of hatred that had motivated the Holocaust, while demonstrating that racial prejudice could transform seemingly civilized individuals into advocates for genocide. His execution on October 16, 1946, eliminated one of the most vicious propagandists in human history, while establishing precedents for prosecuting those who used media to incite mass murder. Evidence presented during the trials documented atrocities on scales that challenged human understanding, from medical experiments that tortured victims in the name of scientific research, to mass executions conducted with bureaucratic efficiency in countries throughout occupied Europe. The meticulous records kept by perpetrators provided irrefutable proof of systematic criminality that had been coordinated at the highest levels of government. Concurrently, massive population transfers reshaped the ethnic map of Eastern Europe, as over 12 million Germans were expelled from territories that had been their ancestral homes for centuries. These forced migrations, sanctioned by the Potsdam Agreement, represented collective punishment for national crimes, while creating new refugee crises that strained resources throughout war-ravaged Europe. Sudeten Germans who had welcomed Wehrmacht occupation in 1938 found themselves loaded onto cattle cars for transport to a defeated homeland many had never seen, carrying only the possessions they could gather during brief notices that gave families hours to abandon homes their ancestors had built over generations. The irony was bitter. Those who had celebrated their liberation from Czech rule now experienced the same uprooting they had helped inflict on others. East Prussia ceased to exist as a political entity when Soviet forces completed its occupation and began systematic deportation of the civilian population to make room for Russian settlers who would transform this ancient Germanic territory into an outpost of Slavic civilization. Königsberg became Kaliningrad, while smaller communities that had possessed German names for over 700 years received Russian designations that erased centuries of cultural continuity. Silesia's industrial resources attracted Soviet attention as machinery and entire factory complexes were dismantled for shipment eastward as reparations for the enormous destruction Wehrmacht forces had inflicted during their invasion and occupation of Soviet territory. This systematic deindustrialization reduced regions that had been economic powerhouses to agricultural backwaters, ensuring that recovery would require decades of reconstruction. General Douglas MacArthur's administration of occupied Japan demonstrated how completely military defeat could transform social and political structures when imposed by victors possessing both overwhelming force and clear reform objectives. The new constitution, promulgated under American guidance, renounced warfare as an instrument of national policy while establishing democratic institutions modeled on Western parliamentary systems. Emperor Hirohito's renunciation of his divine status on January 1st, 1946, symbolized the psychological transformation that defeat had imposed on Japanese society. The man who had been worshipped as a living god now acknowledged his humanity while accepting the democratic reforms that would restructure the nation according to principles his government had previously rejected as incompatible with Japanese culture and traditions. Land reform programs redistributed agricultural property from wealthy landlords to tenant farmers who had worked the soil for generations without owning it, creating a rural middle class that would provide political stability during the challenging years of Reconstruction. These changes eliminated feudal relationships that had persisted into the modern era while establishing economic foundations for the prosperity that would characterize Japan's post-war development. Educational reforms eliminated military training and ultranationalist indoctrination from school curricula, replacing emperor worship with democratic civics and international cooperation. Textbooks that had glorified conquest and racial superiority were replaced with materials emphasizing peaceful development and individual rights, beginning the cultural transformation that would remake Japanese society within a generation. The division of Germany into 4 occupation zones reflected wartime alliance agreements that had seemed reasonable when victory remained distant, but created practical problems that threatened European stability as former allies developed conflicting objectives for their defeated enemy. Soviet policies in the Eastern Zone differed fundamentally from Western approaches in ways that presaged the ideological confrontations that would dominate post-war international relations. Berlin's partition into separate sectors within the Soviet zone created an anomalous situation where democratic enclaves existed hundreds of kilometers inside communist-controlled territory, depending on Russian goodwill for their survival, while serving as symbols of Western determination to maintain their wartime commitments. The former Reich capital became a microcosm of global tensions, as competing systems struggled for influence over populations that had experienced both totalitarian rule and military defeat. Denazification programs attempted to identify and remove Nazi Party members from positions of authority throughout German society. Yet the scope of collaboration with the former regime proved so extensive that complete implementation would have paralyzed reconstruction efforts. Compromises between idealistic objectives and practical necessities resulted in policies that satisfied no one, while demonstrating the difficulties inherent in transforming entire societies through external pressure. Economic recovery proceeded slowly as transportation networks remained disrupted. Industrial facilities had been destroyed or dismantled, and currency systems had collapsed under the strain of wartime expenditures and post-war instability. The German mark became worthless as barter systems replaced monetary transactions in many regions, reducing Europe's most advanced economy to primitive exchanges of food for manufactured goods. Refugee integration posed enormous challenges, as millions of displaced persons required housing, employment, and social services that war-damaged communities could barely provide for their existing populations. Competition for scarce resources generated tensions between established residents and newcomers who brought different dialects, customs, and sometimes religions to regions that had previously been ethnically homogeneous. Cultural reconstruction began with efforts to preserve and restore architectural monuments that had survived the bombing campaigns, representing attempts to maintain connections with historical traditions that provided psychological anchors during periods of revolutionary change. The rebuilding of churches, museums, and universities symbolized determination to recover not just material prosperity, but the intellectual and spiritual foundations of European civilization. International relief organizations, coordinated assistance programs that provided food, medicine, and technical expertise to populations struggling with basic survival, while attempting to rebuild functional societies from the ruins of totalitarian systems. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the International Red Cross, and numerous religious organizations distributed aid that prevented starvation and epidemic disease while supporting the gradual restoration of civil society. War crimes tribunals beyond Nuremberg prosecuted thousands of individuals who had participated in atrocities throughout occupied Europe, establishing legal precedents for international justice while providing some measure of satisfaction to survivors who had witnessed unspeakable crimes against their families and communities. These proceedings documented the full scope of Nazi criminality while beginning the long process of holding perpetrators accountable for their actions. Documentation efforts preserved evidence of the Holocaust and other war crimes for future generations, recognizing that the full truth about these events must be recorded while witnesses remained available to provide testimony. Historians, journalists, and government investigators worked to create comprehensive records that would prevent future denials of well-documented historical facts. The United Nations Charter, signed in San Francisco on June 26, 1945, represented humanity's attempt to create international institutions capable of preventing future global conflicts through collective security and peaceful resolution of disputes. This organization emerged from recognition that modern weapons had made total war potentially suicidal for civilized nations, requiring new approaches to international relations based on law rather than force. Atomic weapons cast shadows over all post-war planning, as political leaders grappled with destructive capabilities that could eliminate entire nations within hours, transforming traditional concepts of national security and international relations. The bombs that had ended the Pacific conflict also created the possibility that future wars might destroy human civilization itself, forcing reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about the role of military power in resolving political disputes. As 1945 drew to its close, the world began emerging from the darkness of total war, while confronting challenges that would shape international relations for generations to come. The defeat of fascism had preserved democratic civilization, yet victory had created new tensions between former allies, whose competing ideologies would soon divide the globe into rival camps. The ruins of the old world provided foundations for reconstruction, but the structures that would rise from this devastation would reflect lessons learned through humanity's most destructive and transformative conflict. The price of victory had been measured in tens of millions of lives, destroyed cities and shattered societies, yet this terrible cost had purchased something precious beyond calculation: the survival of principles that recognize the inherent dignity of individual human beings, regardless of their race, religion, or nationality. From the ashes of the most devastating war in history, new institutions and relationships would emerge based on hope that future generations might build a more just and peaceful world, on foundations established through sacrifice and suffering that must never be forgotten or repeated.